Good morning. Welcome to our webinar this month we're going to be talking about the sulfur cycle and how it might play a role in your sulfur nutrition program. My name is Dr. Cristie Preston and I'm a senior agronomist with Nutrien. And today I want to talk a little bit about sulfur and maybe how you could potentially benefit from understanding how sulfur reacts within the soil and how it cycles and how that might affect your fertilizer decisions that you're going to make. And so, okay, so we have a website here at Nutrien called eKonomics, and pretty much it's based on the science. So a lot of times we choose articles that explain the science behind fertilizer or nutrient management. And typically we'll pick articles that we agree with. We agree that it's good science and how they might be able to help farmers, because our universities are pretty good about trying to, I don't know how to say this, how to determine where maybe the yield gaps are and answer questions that farmers have on a pretty consistent basis. But for sulfur nutrition, we're going to define the essential nutrients and talk about the sulfur cycle and how sulfur interacts within soil. And then we'll switch over to plants and how uptake and mobility might be affected by, say, the form it's in soil. We'll look at deficiency symptoms and talk about diagnostic tools that a farmer might be able to utilize. And then finally, removal rates and how sulfur may be partitioned within the plant and how that might affect your applications or your nutrient management plan for fall application. And then finally, we'll end up with some busted myths that a lot of farmers can fall victim to, and hopefully we'll understand a little bit more about how some of those are just not true. So what is the criteria for an essential nutrient? Pretty much the plant has one goal in life, and that is to produce viable seed. And if it doesn't do that, then it's kind of failed at its major job. But for an essential nutrient, the plant can't perform basic functions without that nutrient. It can't finish its life cycle. And if you do have deficiency symptoms of a particular nutrient, you're not going to be able to substitute them for another one. We'll talk more about sulfur and nitrogen here in a little bit. And of course, the nutrient plays a direct role in the metabolism. And there are 17 essential nutrients that every plant needs. And granted, some plants need some nutrients more than others, but they're all needed for the plant to complete its life cycle. And others can be beneficial, but they don't fit those three criteria above. Now, we have 17 essential nutrients. That means they can't be substituted for another one. And that's where Liebig's law of the minimum comes into play. And you all have all seen the barrel that has different wood pieces and how some of the nutrients or some of the other factors like water might affect your yield potential. But on our eKonomics website, we focus on what I like to call the Mullen Dam. And as you can see in this picture, the yield, or the water being held behind the dam, is your yield potential. So we want to try to maximize that as much as possible. But if we've got any holes in the dam where we're leaking yield or leaking water, that's going to affect our yield potential. And as you can see here, I've got nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, phosphorus, and water. And of course, as we've already discussed, there's more factors that could potentially affect your yield. But when it comes to nutrient management, these are the 5 that you're probably going to see the most response to. but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily more important than the other nutrients. But just showing that if I plug the nitrogen hole, if I've applied enough nitrogen for the plant to maximize yield, if I still have a tiny hole for sulfur, potassium, or phosphorus, then I'm potentially losing out on yield, and I'm not maximizing nutrient use efficiency or anything like that. If I have an essential nutrient that's limited, then if I just keep applying more nitrogen, I'm not necessarily going to be plugging up the holes or keeping that yield from leaking out. And what the law of the minimum means is the fact that whatever your most limiting factor is, and I live in Kansas, so a lot of times it's water. Actually, for the past month up until this past week, we hadn't seen a drop of rain. And so water might have been the most limiting factor. And even though we've applied all these nutrients, but if we could all plan the weather, that would be great. And we'd all be millionaires. But your yield is going to be limiting by your motor. And if that's a macronutrient like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, or sulfur, you could be significantly limiting your yields. So all the nutrients required are broken down into two categories, macro and micronutrients. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that one is more important than the other. This is just a classification of how much nutrients are taken up, or how the quantity of the amount of nutrient that's taken up. So our macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. They're needed in the highest concentrations compared to the micronutrients, chloride, iron, boron, manganese, zinc, copper, molybdenum, and nickel. They're just required in lower amounts, not necessarily that they're less important, because you can still see yield decreases if these nutrients aren't available. And again, Liebig's law of the minimum, your yields are going to be limited by your most limiting factor. So let's take a look at the sulfur cycle. So within this diagram, there are several components, whether it's an input or a loss. And when we talk about losses, we just mean that it's no longer plant available. It's not in the soil profile in that plant available form. And so for our inputs, we could have anywhere from plant residue. So I've grown a crop, I break down the plant residue and it goes back into the soil as organic matter. Or animal manures and biosolids. We can also apply mineral fertilizer and have some atmospheric deposition of sulfate. Now, when it comes to the loss portions of the sulfur cycle, you can have some volatilization. You can have crop harvest, runoff or erosion, mineral formation, and leaching. Now, of these, when we talk about nutrient management plans and the types of the sources of sulfur that we're going to use, we're mainly focused on this leaching portion, because sulfate sulfur is prone to leaching. And that could, depending on your soil characteristics, that could, if you apply it and you lose it, that's potentially going to affect your ROI, and your yields are probably going to suffer because of it. Now, within the soil, and we'll get into more details here, but there are roughly 3 forms of sulfur within the soil: organic, elemental, and sulfate. So as you can see here, there's only one arrow going from a form of sulfur in the soil directly into the plant, and that's the sulfate form. So if you have organic sulfur, either from animal manures or plant residue, it has to undergo mineralization to become plant available as that sulfate form. On the other hand, if you apply elemental sulfur as a mineral fertilizer source, the sulfur has to be oxidized to sulfate to become plant available and be taken up in the plant. So the loss mechanisms, really, a farmer can focus the most on plant uptake, which leads to organic plant residues. Sulfur concentrations in plants typically are similar to phosphorus levels. Crop removal, that's the big one, because since sulfur is mobile within the soil, kind of following the same patterns as nitrogen, may not necessarily be the best soil test for it. So a lot of times we need to focus specifically on crop removal of sulfur to be able to better predict how much we need to be applying back to the soil. Again, those coefficients that are specific per crop may not necessarily be exact, but at least it's a starting point since there's not a good soil test. So if we look at what's being removed in the grain and what might need to be required for, say, a yield goal the next year, we can focus on the removal and those uptake levels. Again, the big one for loss mechanisms, sulfate. Sulfur is very prone to leaching in coarse textured soils, low organic matter soils, that just don't have a lot of capacity for holding on to nutrients. Now, if you get a big rainfall event and you do have coarse or low organic matter soils, then you're potentially going to see some sulfate moving within the profile. Again, that it may not be completely lost, but it's at least lost out of the root zone and not available for plant uptake. Volatilization, minimum losses of SO2 gas, and then finally runoff or erosion. This is just the surface water runoff or the erosion of soil. Again, probably pretty minimal losses here. So sulfur in soils, the majority of the sulfur is present as matter or crop residue. And these organic matters or organic compounds are not plant available. They have to be converted to sulfate through mineralization for them to be, for the sulfate to be plant available. Now, the speed of which organic matter is converted is very dependent on organism, communities, temperature, moisture, and any other factor that would affect the microbial activity. So since it's a microbial driven process, then any factor that might affect that microbe community, it's going to affect that transformation in soil. Now, and when the soils cool down in the wintertime, you're not going to see these mineralization rates at a high level. They're going to be slowed down because the microbes are not as active. Now, sulfate is generally soluble and readily moves through the soil profile to the roots. And with high rainfall events or excessive irrigation, it can be reached out of the root zone. Now, one factor that a lot of times farmers don't realize is if they are irrigating their crops, depending on their water source, they could be supplying sulfur to the crop. And sorry, that one just popped into my head with excessive irrigation. But as someone who does quite a bit of field research, a lot of times it's hard to find crops in a particular area that might actually respond to sulfur fertilizer because the sulfur concentrations are high enough in their irrigation water. Tidbit, maybe you should consider testing those to make sure that you're not over applying nutrients if you do irrigate your crops. So it's not necessarily the presence of organic matter that gives life to the soil. I like to show this, and actually this is a screenshot of someone else's slide, and I'm not entirely sure who gave the presentation, but it always resonates with me because a lot of times we're talking about sequestering carbon within the soil, and we're talking about building up organic matter in the soil. Yes, that is great. It makes it healthier. But what makes it the most healthiest is that breakdown of the organic matter. And what does that mean for sulfur? It means that if I do have high organic matter of, say, above 3%, then more than likely my crop is getting some sulfur as that organic matter is breaking. So again, it's the breakdown that gives the life to soils, because that organic matter, it's not plant available, or the nutrients that are available in the organic form are not plant available, and they have to be transformed to usable forms. Now on the other side of that, so we've got organic forms being mineralized into sulfate to become plant available. Now, if I apply mineral fertilizer that has elemental sulfur, it also has to be oxidized to that sulfate form before the plant can take it up. And again, it's a microbe-driven process. And a lot of times we misinterpret oxidation rates, but I like to put them into two different categories, looking at the environmental and the soil factors, and then looking at the fertilizer factors. So again, it's a microbe-driven process. So anything that affects the microbes, whether it's soil temperature, moisture, aeration, or soil pH, that's going to affect the oxidation rate. Again, if same as the mineralization process, if your soils are, say, below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius, then you might see those oxidation rates because the microbe activity has slowed down. But on the other hand, if we're looking at specifically the fertilizer sources, then we're looking at the sulfur particle size within the granule, the distribution within the granule, and the dispersion of that particle. And so if we're taking something like granular elemental sulfur, a 00090 product, it might take months for that product to break down and oxidize into the sulfate to become plant available because the particle size is larger. Now, if more specialty products that are on the market have smaller particle sizes, you should potentially see those oxidation rates increase because you're increasing the surface area. And we could talk more about at a different time about sulfur particle distribution in the fertilizer, but as long as you're maximizing the fertilizer to soil contact, you should see higher oxidation rates as well. So we had a presentation, I believe it was last week, from my coworker Mike Howe on how pH affects nutrients in soil, and I believe he had a similar graph that he showed. But a lot of times the first question I ask whenever I step on a farmer's field is, what is your pH? Because you could throw all the nutrients out there in the world and still not be maximizing your yields, because these nutrients, if it's the wrong pH, they're being tied up and they're being chemically unavailable to the plant. Sulfur is unique in that, okay, so say below 6, pH of 6, your availability is going to be decreased. Relatively consistent, but a lot of these other nutrients, if your pH is not, somewhere between 6, 6.5 to 7, you could potentially be showing nutrient deficiencies. And we can go through here in a minute on what actual sulfur deficiency looks like. But number one question, because again, you could be applying all the nutrients in the world, but if your pH is just a little off, a little too low, a little too high, you may not be maximizing your nutrient use efficiency with some of these nutrients. Now we've got macronutrients. They're needed in the greatest quantities by plants. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. But just because a nutrient may be mobile within the soil doesn't necessarily mean it's mobile within the plant. And we'll talk about why that's important here in a minute. But here I have listed the uptake forms of each nutrient. So nitrogen, uptaken as the nitrate ion or the ammonium ion. Phosphate, potassium taken up as the potassium ion, calcium, magnesium, and then sulfate. Again, if it's organic or if it's in the elemental form, has to be converted to sulfate before it can be taken up. But most importantly, even though sulfate sulfur is mobile within the soil, it's not necessarily mobile within the plant. So when we talk about soil mobility, that just means it moves with water. So it can be leached just like nitrogen can. But a good example of an immobile nutrient in the soil is phosphorus. But nitrate and sulfate both have a higher potential for leaching. When we talk about mobility in the plant, that really just means where you're going to see the nutrient deficiency symptoms. And that's important whenever it comes to nitrogen and sulfur, because a lot of times they're mistaken for the other one. Now, this is a picture from IPNI that depicts where you will see these nutrient deficiency symptoms. So as you can see, the older portions of the plant, you would see nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. Now, when a nutrient is mobile within the plant, that means that as the newer growing portion, these younger leaves, as they continue to grow and do photosynthesis, because that's how a plant continues on into its life cycle. As those new plant portions are growing, these nutrients are being translocated to those areas. If you think about it, they're closer to the sun, photosynthesis, because they're on top. Now, if the nutrients are mobile, they're being translocated to those growing portions. That's why you'll see nutrient deficiencies in the older portions. If you've walked through a cornfield and that's nitrogen deficient, those bottom leaves are fired. They're chlorotic. But the ones at the top, the ones at the younger growing portions, they could be dark green because that plant has taken up nitrogen before that point, but it's sent it to those leaves so that it can continue to maximize its growth. On the other hand, if you see nutrient deficiency symptoms in the younger portions of the leaves, that means it's an immobile nutrient within the plant. It's not being translocated. And so this becomes important because it's almost like the plant needs a steady source of these nutrients because they can't be translocated. They have to be taken up and sent to those younger portions so that they can continue to grow. And any of these nutrients that directly affect chlorophyll are going to affect photosynthesis, and the plant is not going to maximize its production as good. Specifically with sulfur, it's immobile within the plant, so you're going to see deficiency symptoms in these younger portion of the plant. So sulfur function within the plant, it's required for protein synthesis. And we're going to get into how sulfur interacts with nitrogen here in a minute because they're both needed for protein synthesis. It aids in seed production and producing chlorophyll. Again, so if your plants are limited in sulfur, then your chlorophyll levels might be low, which is going to directly affect photosynthesis, and your yields potentially are going to be limited. Sulfur is required for nodule formulation in legumes. So having an adequate amount of sulfur before a soybean crop is essential so that that relationship can form and the rhizobia can fix nitrogen so that the soybean plants have enough nitrogen. Deficiency can result in low grain quality in wheat. So all your bakers out there, if your wheat crop has been sulfur deficient, guess what? That can potentially affect the way it bakes in breads and other commodities. It's also involved in secondary plant compounds. But fun fact, so if you're ever at trivia night, you can, and somebody says, you know, why do your eyes water whenever you're cutting an onion? Or why do they burn if you touch your eye after you've cut up garlic? Well, guess what? That's because of sulfur. So sulfur deficiency, again, we're going to see sulfur deficiency in the younger portions, and that's different from nitrogen. So some of the smaller crops that we have, say this first picture, it may be difficult to see, you know, to be able to tell if it's a younger or older portion, but in a corn crop, like all the way over here to the right, you're seeing that striping, that chlorosis, that chlorotic striping in the younger portions. That's how it differs from nitrogen deficiency. Again, once it's taken up into the plant and it's in organic form, it's not going to be translocated within the plant. So that's why we see it in the younger portion. Now, if it may not necessarily, or if the whole plant, say, is sulfur deficient, they just might be small, spindly plants and potentially could be delayed in maturity. So the big question is, why are we seeing more and more sulfur deficiency? And I feel like we're kind of beating a dead horse whenever we talk about the Clean Air Act, but in reality, that's the reality we're living in, is the fact that we're not getting the sulfur deposition that we were, say, 40 years ago. And this is due to the Clean Air Act. The industrial processes are not releasing SO2 gas, and we're not getting the acid rain from the release of that industrial process. Sorry. So back in 1986, you can see here on this map, I mean, we're talking about widespread red areas with 20 kilograms per hectare of wet sulfate deposition. Now that was enough to meet crop needs. Now, but since we've started cleaning up our air and not seeing as much sulfate deposition, say in 2016, we still have some areas down here in Louisiana and Texas where we are still seeing some deposition, but it's not enough to meet crop demand. And as we have higher yields, we're going to see more and more sulfur deficiency over the years. So I walk up to a field, and how do I tell it's sulfur deficiency? Like what can I do to make sure that I know that, yes, this is sulfur deficiency? One good way, and it's not necessarily, you have to use it in combination. So this is a great diagnostic tool. So if we've got this field down here in the right-hand corner, you can see areas of chlorosis, this yellowing, then you've got areas of dark green. If I walk up to this field, I'm like, okay, what do I do? You can take soil samples. Again, this is not to make nutrient recommendations or anything like that. This is to say, I'm going to take a soil sample from the good area, and I'm going to take a soil sample from the bad area or the chlorotic area. But then I'm also going to come back and I'm going to take a plant sample from the good area and also the bad area, so that it's a diagnostic tool so that I can compare them just to see what the levels are. Now, on the eKonomics website, we have a couple of articles that talk about sufficiency levels within the plant. But here, we just want to look at if the bad area has significantly less sulfur within the plant tissue or within the soil, then more than likely, that's why I that's why these areas are not doing as well. Now, some crops can respond to a sulfur application if it's made early enough in the growing season. So something like, say, corn, if I'm seeing sulfur deficiency at a V4 to V6 time frame, again, but at the same time, it might potentially grow out of it as those roots get deeper into the soil, but because there's more organic matter potentially as you go deeper in the soil profile. But at the same time, if I supplement sulfur fertilizer, I could potentially maybe not limit the yield anymore. Again, double check with your university if you're going to send these soil and plant tissue samples. Make sure that it matches up with the with the values that you're going to get back, whether it's a 0 to 6 soil sample, a 6 to 12, or a 12 to 24. Now here in Kansas, they recommend a profile sample, so that 0 to 24 inch sample. But since sulfate is mobile within the soil, it's not the best ever for making nutrient recommendations. And that's why we talked about the crop removal. And with that, with plant sampling, you could potentially take whole plant samples at maturity or have your grain analyzed for sulfur concentration just to see how much is actually being removed, because it is dependent on different varieties, different hybrids. Now there's a lot going on in this graph, but the main thing we want to focus on is sulfur uptake in pounds of sulfur per acre over the life cycle of the corn plant. So at a specific growth stage, there's going to be different amounts of sulfur there's going to be different amounts of sulfur being taken up. Now, the interesting thing about sulfur is the fact that accumulation is greater during grain fill, with more than half of the sulfur taken up after this VT to R1 stage. Again, it's not being translocated into the plant, it's being taken up and sent to these portions of the plant. Now, of the total sulfur taken up, you can see that more than half of it is being moved to the grain, and that means higher removal rates per bushel of crop produce. Again, not saying that looking at how much sulfur is being taken up will affect your, it can potentially affect how you manage nutrients, especially if you know that your soils are prone to leaching. So coarse texture soils, low organic matter soils, that if you've applied a sulfate form of fertilizer and it's leached through the soil profile, it may not necessarily be available whenever it comes VT or R1, and half of the sulfur is being taken up after that point. But at the same time, if I'm trying to make, say, a rescue application, so I know that I had a huge rainfall event, I know I've lost sulfur, or my plants are showing sulfur deficiency at, say, V4 to V6, then I need to make sure that I apply a form of sulfate fertilizer that is readily available. That way I get it into the crop as soon as possible. So an option might be ammonium sulfate. So common sulfur removal rates per bushel produced. As you can see, canola, flaxseed, soybeans, they remove the most phosphorus per bushel produced. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they remove more than other crops. That just means per bushel produced. And you can use these coefficients to determine what your application rates might need to be. So again, there's not a good soil test for sulfur. Actually, a lot of states don't even recommend it, but this is a good way for me to say, I've produced 200 bushel corn. and I want to make sure that I'm at least applying what I removed with that 200 bushel corn. That's around 16 pounds of sulfur. A 60 bushel soybean crop, potentially removing 11 pounds of sulfur. Use this to make sure that I'm applying what I removed, but at the same time, if I'm looking at producing 20 bushels or 200 bushels of corn this upcoming year, I need to make sure that I at least have 16 pounds of sulfur out there that's available for plant uptake. Again, you might not necessarily see a sulfur response from fertilizer applications if you have high organic matter soils or if you're using irrigation water that is high in sulfur. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to not see a response to fertilizer application. But you do need to know that if you do see the deficiency symptoms, an application needs to be made if I'm going to maximize my yield. And again, any legume that is trying to, that forms this relationship with rhizobia to form nodules on the roots, sulfur is key to having that, to establishing that relationship and allowing for that nitrogen to be fixed. Now, there is an interaction between nitrogen and sulfur within the plant because they're both needed for protein formation. So these ratios of nitrogen to sulfur can vary depending on the crop. But if it's a legume, more than likely you're going to need more sulfur per unit of nitrogen. So let's take, actually soybeans are actually lower. So any crop like corn or canola carrying a 6 or an 8-to-1 ratio of nitrogen to sulfur, you are going to need more sulfur compared to other crops in nitrogen. But going back to that point before, soybean crop where sulfur is needed for that rhizobia relationship to be formed, it's essential. But alfalfa carrying a 9-to-1 ratio, you're going to need more sulfur to maximize that nitrogen that you've applied or the nitrogen that's being utilized from that rhizobia relationship. Now, since sulfur is an essential nutrient, applying more nitrogen is not going to cause the deficiency to become better, and can actually, in some cases, decrease fertilizer efficiency and cause the deficiency symptoms to be worse. So over applying nitrogen, it's not ideal for your return on investment. It's not ideal for your ROI. You need both nutrients at a certain level to maximize production. The most common sources of sulfur fertilizers, ammonium sulfate solution, ammonium thiosulfate, sulfomag, potassium sulfate, gypsum, and then elemental sulfur. And here I also have the values from 2016 of how much fertilizer was sold. But as you can see, 1.8 million tons of ammonium sulfate or AMS, or 2.4 million tons of gypsum. Gypsum, not necessarily a fertilizer source in the US, but more of a soil amendment. But at the same time, it does supply sulfur as a sulfate form. And then elemental sulfur. Not that much being used because a lot of times it does have issues with breaking down and becoming plant available. But its main use is for acidifying soils that have too high a pH. So we're coming up on the fall season, and a lot of times farmers ask, what can I do to maximize my sulfur efficiency? Or actually, the better question is, I run out of time in the spring, year after year after year. I run out of time. I'm trying to do tillage, I'm trying to apply my fertilizer, and I'm trying to plant. Well, guess what? Of those three, the most important one is getting the plant in the ground, or getting the seed in the ground at an ideal time with enough moisture, not too much. But I've got these other two processes that I have to do, or that I want to do before I even plant. How can I take one of those away? And the biggest trend that we're seeing is fall application. But what do I need to know to be able to apply sulfur this fall? And it really depends on the crop being grown, whether it's corn, alfalfa, wheat, canola. These crops show the greatest response to sulfur fertilizer, but at the same time, they're all completely different. Down here in Kansas, we grow winter wheat. We grow winter wheat, so we need to make sure that we have enough sulfur for the plant this fall before the soil temperatures cool down, or we have to use a sulfate form to make enough sulfur's there so the plant can tiller before it overwinters. If we're looking at, say, corn crop, we might bulk blend our sulfur with our potash or our phosphorus this fall. But it depends on your soil characteristics on whether or not you can apply a sulfate form in the fall without carrying a higher potential for loss. So that's when an elemental form might come into play. But at the same time, you kind of want those soil temperatures to drop below, say, 50 degrees if you're going to apply an elemental form, to decrease your potential for losses, and that way it'll be available next spring. Again, soil type. If I've got low organic matter, below 3%, or I've got coarse textured soils, may not necessarily be the greatest condition for applying fertilizer in the fall. But I can apply it in the spring right before, or I can try a different fertilizer source if I fall into the categories of low organic matter and coarse texture. We talked about elemental sulfur and the fact that it does require some time for oxidation. But at the same time, if you choose to use a specialty product that might have smaller particle sizes, you might see faster oxidation rates compared to a 00090 product. And above all, look at past results. We're having a big push for collecting all types of data on farm, whether it's yield, soil test maps, soil management zones, CEC, various machine data. We're getting it all. But if I'm consistently seeing sulfur deficiencies year after year, I need to take a step back and I need to look at it. Am I applying enough? Am I applying these products, if they are specialty products, am I applying them so that I'm maximizing their results? Like, I'm not setting the product up for failure. I'm making sure that I've got the right soil type. I'm fertilizing my crop whenever it needs it most. I'm using the right source. These are all questions that we can take a step back and look at. And sometimes crops can respond to in-season applications. And this is true for some crops with sulfur. And it's also true for a lot of crops with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as well. But take a step back, look at your farm. Actually, me personally, I'm a huge promoter of on-farm research and just yes-no trials. I mean, we're talking about one pass with fertilizer and one pass with not without. Don't get me wrong there. I'm saying maybe do the practice that you've been doing for years, and then maybe come in with an additional, if you're going to have a cool spring, maybe I come in with a starter fertilizer that's got a little bit of phosphorus, sulfur, potassium, maybe a little bit of nitrogen too. And because if those soil temperatures aren't warming up quick enough, maybe it's limiting these nutrients being available. But if you do on-farm research, just do like a yes, no, maybe apply a little bit more sulfur or apply it at more of an ideal time or readily available form like ammonium sulfate, and see if you get that yield bump there. And if you don't, then no harm, no foul, but at least you've tried it out. Finally, let's talk about some of the biggest myths that we have for sulfur management. And we've already touched on every single one of these a little bit, but at the end of the day, we still hear these common misconceptions around the industry. Elemental sulfur does take time to oxidize, or it does take months, but it all depends on your sulfur particle size and the distribution within the granule. If it's got any type of barrier that is limiting the soil to fertilizer interaction, then you might be limiting your sulfur oxidation rates. If you focus on a fertilizer that's got, say, smaller particle size, or it's evenly distributed, it could oxidize quicker. Some elemental forms are going to take months, but at the same time, those products are really good for, say, decreasing your soil pH if your pHs are too high. Applying more nitrogen will correct any sulfur deficiency. In all reality, additional nitrogen can actually make sulfur deficiency worse sometimes and negatively affect yield. But by understanding that there is a relationship there, farmer can maximize both nutrients and maximize your nutrient use efficiency. Sulfur is only needed at the beginning of the growing season. Now, some crops do need more sulfur early on, but as you saw in the graph with corn uptake, you're seeing half of the sulfur that the crop's taken up occurring after it reaches a reproductive stage, and it's being put right towards that grain fill. Now, if that's the case, you need to make sure that you have enough sulfur available. Since it's not mobile within the plant, you need to make sure that you've got enough sulfur available for the plant to utilize it so that it can maximize photosynthesis. Sulfur applications made this fall or leached before spring. That's not necessarily true. It all has to do with the source of sulfur that you're utilizing in your fertilizer. It's just like nitrogen. If you wait till the soil temperatures are below, say, 50 degrees, there's a lot of research that shows that you're not going to get that microbial activity. But at the same time, you're not going to see the organic matter breaking down to the sulfate to become plant available, and you're not going to see those oxidation rates from the elemental sulfur. But with that, it's important that if you're growing a crop in, say, a cool season soil, then you need to make sure that you have a readily available form, aka sulfate, because the organic matter is not going to be breaking down and the oxidation rates of the elemental sulfur are not going to be occurring, but you've still potentially got an actively growing crop. All right. I think I actually did okay on time. I didn't say it at the very beginning, but there is a Q&A button down at the bottom. So if you have any questions on sulfur, I'll try to get through the majority of them as fast as I can. But we do have a website, nutrien-economics.com, and that's economics with a K. And also follow us on Twitter at oh, and I misspelled it. It's at Nutrien_econ. All right, I'll switch over and let's see what questions that we have. So he says, farmers usually apply fertilizer during planting or V6. Which one is the most suggested, during planting or V6? Should we consider this into consideration, maybe soils applied later? Yes, I agree with that. So the question is maybe sandy soils applied later and heavy soils apply before. And with that, heavy soils, you do have the potential of applying earlier because you're not going to have the instances where the fertilizer or the sulfate can be lost. With that being said, though, you want to make sure that you're not limiting the crop, the corn crop, early on, that it's got enough sulfur that it can begin to germinate and form into the seedling phase. But yes, you do carry a higher chance of leaching losses in the sandy soils. And a lot of times it makes sense for farmers to make multiple applications if they do have sandy soils. Okay. Okay. Well, we've got a couple more minutes if anyone, actually a conversation that had the other day was on if farmers typically applied sulfur every year, and it really depends on the crop that you're growing. A lot of times farmers might historically have only applied sulfur to the crops where you're going to see the most response and potentially try to build up soil levels. That process doesn't necessarily work, especially after years and years of higher yields and higher removal rates. We're seeing sulfur deficiency in almost every crop. Sometimes it's not as visible, but we'll potentially see it in yield. So as much sulfur deficiency as we're seeing year after year, I don't think that you will be able to take a year off, especially like we're beating it, but especially if you're in soils that are prone to losses or cool and you're not getting, say sulfur from other sources. Another question came in that says, should sulfur be applied in the fall? And I'm a huge promoter of fall application if you apply the right source. Know that sulfate can potentially be lost, but at the same time, you can choose, say, an elemental form, and then as the soils warm up in the spring, you'll get that oxidation. And sometimes specialty fertilizers that have smaller particle sizes can potentially prolong sulfur availability and kind of act as a slow release or as a slow release fertilizer and have enough sulfur available when the crop's going to be taking it up the most, which we've seen can be, say 50% before reproductive stages. Well, that concludes the sulfur cycling and sulfur nutrition. Look for an invite to future webinars that we're going to have, and definitely check out the eKonomics website. Again, that's nutrien-economics.com, economics with a K. Thanks, guys.